Thank you for joining me in this video about Skyrim with the Requiem overhaul, and today we're going to be talking about racial abilities. As you probably already know, Requiem does a total revamp of each of the playable races that are available to you at the start of the game, and often in pretty dramatic ways. I have two goals in making this video. First, I'm hoping to consolidate a lot of the information that's already out there. You can find all of this stuff online, but a lot of the information is either outdated or incomplete, and it's scattered across various different pages, so hopefully putting it all in one place is convenient. Second, I'm hoping that this will make it easier for you to create builds that will be able to go all the way through the endgame content. And that's because there are some abilities that you simply must have with your character if you want to tackle the later game bosses. You're going to need a certain amount of resistances, you're going to need a certain level of damage from whatever skill you happen to choose, and the race that you pick at the start can actually have a big impact in how you decide to build, what abilities you decide to choose, what perks, and what gear is going to make it possible for you to go all the way with that character. And I am coming at this from the perspective of someone whose other most played games are Path of Exile and Dark Souls, both of which put a big emphasis on character builds. So this is somewhat of a min-maxing video. And of course, Skyrim with Requiem is intended to be a role-playing game, so your fun and your roleplay does come first. Sometimes I'll just pick a race because I haven't played them recently and I want to see how it goes, and that's perfectly valid as well. But knowing what your abilities are from the start and having a plan for your character can make your playthrough both more fun and quite a bit easier, so that you don't have to slog through lower level content for a long time before you can tackle the higher level stuff. And I will say that the title of this video is a bit of a misnomer. There really is no best race in Requiem. They're all pretty balanced with different strengths and weaknesses, and they lend themselves to different builds. So hopefully this will be helpful to you as you're planning your next character, and ultimately I'll be giving a lot of my opinions throughout this, but it is all subjective, so I'll welcome any other viewpoints that people might want to add onto this video, and I hope you will leave those for me in the comments. All that being said, let's jump in. I'll be covering the starting stats for each race, their proficiencies, their skill gain bonuses, and I'll give my own subjective rating of each of their racial powers. First up, let's talk about the Altmer, or the High Elves, which are the most focused magic casting race available to you within Requiem, and you can see this reflected in their stats. They have the highest based magicka of any class in the game. They also have the highest magicka regeneration rate of any class in the game, offset by relatively lower health and carry weight. Their abilities give them a 10% penalty in increased stamina cost for power attacks, meaning they're rather poor in melee combat because they run out of stamina very quickly, but they have 5% less magicka cost for spells. Their spells are 5% stronger and last 5% longer, and they have 10% increased spell range. That may not sound very big, but it's actually very helpful, especially when you're casting minions, to be able to put them further away and closer to your enemies. Their skill gain rates, they get a 10% bonus to all magicka skill gain rates, and they have a proficiency in alchemy and enchanting, meaning that they can create potions and recharge items without needing a perk in either of those areas. Their power is highborn, which makes their magic practically inexhaustible for a short time each day. What it means is you can spam spells for 30 seconds and effectively win the fight that you want to in that particular time frame, but you can only use it once per day. Their resistances, they get a 75% disease resistance, which is nice to not have to worry so much about being afflicted by animals that might bite you and so on, but they have a 40% weakness to magic, meaning that they are much worse in magical duels against other mages. And when you're building an Altmer character, there's a couple of ways you can play around that. The first way is you could take the Atronach stone, and then once you get alteration up to 100, you could take the magical absorption there, and then you'd have 80% magicka absorb, but still 1 out of 5 times you'll get one shot by a mage. The second way is you could go toward all the alteration magical resistance perks. You could take the Lord Stone, and that's enough to get you back up to the base level of roughly even magic resist, and then hopefully your gear can take you the rest of the way. Altmer can actually be pretty effective as heavy armored characters, because a lot of the heavy armor that you can pick up will have magicka resistance on it for you, and if you don't plan to engage in melee combat, it'll also protect you from arrows, which are otherwise a mage's worst enemy. So the Altmer, they have a great starting stat allocation. and really strong magical skills, and their power is quite strong. I personally would call it a B+ because it's great in the early game, but sort of drops off later once your magic pool is large enough. So if you want to have a caster character and you're willing to build around that weakness to magic, an Altmer can be an excellent choice for that particular style. Now let's talk about the Argonians, the famous lizard people of Skyrim. They start with above average total starting stats, with a weighting towards stamina and a decent amount of health, and also a respectable amount of magic. So you could do pretty much any build starting as an Argonian. Their initial attributes: they have strong stomach, so they're able to take advantage of the extremely strong bestial stew in order to regenerate their stamina. They also have a water breathing ability, which also gives reduced stamina drain while swimming underwater. This doesn't come up very often, but it's occasionally helpful. It allows you to make some quick escapes or get away from enemies in cases where you might not be able to otherwise. Their skill gain rates: they have a 10% bonus for evasion and lockpicking, and a 5% bonus for pickpocketing, sneak, alteration, and restoration. So the initial thought for many Argonian players is that they would want to go toward a thieving type character to take advantage of those lockpicking and pickpocket type of bonuses, but it's not really necessary for you to do that because they do actually make pretty strong warrior characters. They have a proficiency in alchemy and sneak, and the ability to use those skills without having to put initial points into them. Again, this is nice. It can save you perk points if you wanted to go more combat focused and didn't want to have to drop any points into sneak. You could still get away with a few sneak attacks here and there. And similarly with alchemy, even if you didn't want to invest heavily into it, you could still create some basic potions. Their resistances: they have a 75% disease resistance, which is useful but not entirely necessary, and then they have a 90% poison resistance, which is actually extremely good because a lot of the really dangerous enemies that you fight, like Falmer and Chorus and so on, will hit you with poison, and not having to worry about gearing against poison makes your life quite a bit easier. You can focus on other resistances instead. Their power is His Skin, which it restores 10 health per second for 60 seconds and 1 health per second for 3,600 seconds, and you can use it once per day. This is pretty strong, especially in the early game. It means you don't need to use potions quite as regularly. The only downside is that many of the really dangerous attacks that will actually kill you later on in the game, they come in big burst form, and so regeneration may not save you from them. However, it's still pretty helpful, and it can make you advantaged in a longer fight. And the type of builds you might want to play with Argonian: you could really do almost anything. You get more advantage out of their skill gain bonuses if you go in more of a thieving and evasion direction, but they're also surprisingly good for heavy armor because in a longer fight, the His Skin ability will mean you can outlast a lot of your opponents, and their starting skills mean that they're not overly weighted in one direction or another. The Bosmer, or Wood Elves, are the most focused archery or sneak archer character that you can build within Requiem. Their starting stats are weighted more towards stamina, which is very helpful if you're doing archery because the stamina cost of drawing a bow is very high. You also need lots of stamina to move around and keep your mobility, but they do have the lowest carry weight in the game, which can be kind of a problem for lugging around enough arrows to fight all of your enemies. Their stats also include a 15% penalty for power attacks. They cost additional stamina, meaning that you would prefer to stay out of melee combat wherever possible. The offset of this is that the Bosmer can loot strange meat, quote unquote, from humanoid enemies. Eating that gives you a constant magicka and stamina regeneration, and it also gives you a 20% boost to your weapons, which is pretty huge. The Bosmer also have strong stomach, meaning that they can eat raw meat or bestial stew, but you'll have so much strange meat available. It's so plentiful from killing humanoid enemies that you can practically have that up all the time, giving you massive stamina and magicka regeneration, which is a giant bonus. Their skill gain rates: they have a 15% bonus toward archery, which is very helpful because otherwise marksmanship is a pretty slow skill to level up. They also have 5% bonuses for sneak, lockpicking, pickpocket, light armor, and alchemy, and you can kind of see the sort of character that the Requiem developers were expecting you to build: something focused on thievery, stealth, and catching your enemies by surprise. To augment that, they also have proficiencies in alchemy and sneak, meaning that you don't need to take the first perks in either of those in order to start using those skills. It's also very helpful that you can sneak just from the start of the game. Even if you don't put any points into sneak whatsoever, you can often still get off surprise attacks against your enemies. Their resistance includes a 75% disease resistance. This is probably the least useful of the resistances that there are, but it's very good if your character happens to be a thievery or Dark Brotherhood oriented character, because you won't have access to the shrines. So in that sense, it all kind of synergizes together to push you towards a sneaky thieving character, and it's a very effective and fun playstyle in order for you to use. Their racial power gives the ability to make all nearby enemy animals into allies once per day. They won't follow you around, but this is a nice way to avoid getting yourself killed by saber cats and stuff as you're running around in the early game, so it's helpful there. But I ultimately rate this power just a B-, because as you get further into the game, animals are just not much of a threat, and even when they're on your side, they're not very proactive in going and tracking down enemies to fight for you. But if you want to have a sneak archer character and focus heavily on archery, a Bosmer is certainly a good way to go. The Bretons come with mediocre starting stats but have some really excellent racial abilities. Their opening attributes are weighted more toward magicka. They have the second most after the High Elves, and then a decent amount of health and stamina, but nothing too exceptional there. They also have a penalty of 10% increased stamina cost for power attacks, meaning you probably want to stay away from melee focused builds if you decide to do a Breton. Their skill gain rates, they have a 10% bonus toward conjuration, then a 5% bonus for all other magical skills plus alchemy. So in this way, they're kind of like the Altmer light. You can see that they're being pushed a little bit more toward a magical direction, but they don't have quite as strong bonus as the High Elves do. They have a proficiency for alchemy and enchanting, so you can use those skills without having to invest points into them. It means that if you decide to not do a pure magic character, you can still get some utility out of crafting a few potions or recharging your weapons and save your skill points for something else. The big reason to use Bretons is that they have a 20% resistance to magic right at the start, which is absolutely huge. It makes it much easier to gear up your character for the late game. And just with the Breton 20% bonus plus some perks in alteration, and then if you take the Lord Stone, suddenly you're 2/3 of the way resistant to magic already without even getting into any of your gear. It makes it much simpler for you to build your character and prepare it for the late game. It's one of the reasons that I've played a lot of Breton characters, just because that starting 20% magic resist is so strong. Their racial power is Dragon Skin. It gives you 100% magic absorb for 8 seconds. You can use it once per day, and this is absolutely amazing. You can use it against high-level mages or against dragon priests and make yourself effectively invincible, and then in that time you can use your spells to smash them apart and win the fight within that time. And this, I think, is probably the strongest racial ability, because so many of the really threatening things that you'll run into later in the game have magic-based attacks. So building a Breton character, I think there are two very good ways you can do it. First is to do a Nightblade style, where you're focused on having a lot of stealth, and then you use your magic to supplement that and get you out of tight spots if you find yourself being overwhelmed. Or if you wanted to do a character that was just going to run around in robes and not use any armor whatsoever in order to maximize your magic casting ability, I think Bretons are probably the best choice for that, because otherwise a robes only character can have some trouble getting enough magic resist, because there just isn't that much magic resistant clothing, at least until you get pretty far into the game. So having that initial bonus makes it a lot more viable to just use a robes only character. Overall, I think Bretons are one of the strongest races just because of their initial bonus to magic resist and their extremely strong racial ability, which I'm going to call an A+. The Dunmer have perhaps the most balanced set of starting attributes and can lend themselves to a variety of different builds. They come with 100 each of health, magic, and stamina, as well as 100 carry weight, putting them right in the middle of pretty much every racial class and lending themselves to nearly any build you could think of. They have skill rate bonuses of 10% in destruction and one-handed. Those are both really good to have, because those can be some of the slower leveling skills as you go forward into the game. And then they have a 3% bonus for every other skill, which means that they can just level up slightly faster than any other character that you might be using. They are the only race that has 3 different proficiencies in alchemy, enchanting, and sneak. This is actually pretty good because it can save you a lot of perk points, and making it unnecessary to put points into several different skills and still getting some utility out of them means you can focus more on your chosen damage skills and your defenses without having to worry as much about your perk points going into these skills that don't directly improve your combat. And the Dunmer have a 65% resistance to fire. It's actually very, very helpful in gearing up because you can pretty much not worry about having fire resist and just get other resistances on your gear. This makes them quite a bit better in the late game. Although fire is not the most dangerous element as you get further into the game, most of the later game enemies are using lightning against you, or often cold, but still there are a lot of fire-based enemies, and this can be pretty helpful, especially if you want to go and do the Dragonborn content. Their power gives them a 95% physical damage resistance for 30 seconds once per day. That's actually really excellent. It's comparable to the Dragon Skin or the Mage Armor rank 5 skill, which also gives you a near immunity to physical damage. The only reason that I would rate this less than an A is that most of the really dangerous attacks that will kill you later on in the game are elemental based. This won't help you very much against Dragon Priests or against mages, but it is pretty good against some of the more dangerous physical enemies like the ebony vampires and so on. So building a Dunmer character, you can do pretty much anything with them. Heavy armor, light armor, mages, whatever you might happen to choose. They're pretty good at everything. So there's not any specific build that you're being pushed towards if you choose a dark elf. That flexibility is pretty nice, and it gives you a lot of options as to how you want to develop your character. And also the fact that they have the 3 proficiencies gives you a lot of choices as to where you're going to allocate your perks. I would call them a very middle of the road race. They're pretty good at everything, not exceptional at any particular one, but that can be a pretty fun character style to play. The Imperials are another well-rounded race which can lend itself to a lot of different builds. They come with the best starting stats in the game with a huge boost to their starting stamina with 160, and then still a decent amount of health and magicka if you decided to go in a different direction. They come with a bonus for their power attacks with a 20% lower stamina cost, so whether you're doing heavy armor, light armor, one-handed or two-handed, that bonus is going to come in pretty handy, letting you stay in combat for longer without seeing your damage drop. They also have a bonus of restoring 2 stamina per second while sprinting. It effectively cuts the cost of sprinting in half. This may not sound like a big deal, but it makes it a lot easier to get around in the early game, and it means when you arrive at your destination and you want to fight, you're not going to be worn out. And so this can actually make them much more mobile for your both early and late game needs. They have skill gain bonuses of 10% in speechcraft and restoration, and then 5% for destruction, one-handed, block, and heavy armor. So based on that, it seems like Imperials are pushed more toward a battle mage style of play, where you have a weapon in one hand and a spell in the other, but of course that's not the only way for you to build them. The big downside of the Imperials to offset their great starting stats is that they don't come with any innate resistances, so you'll have to think pretty hard about how you want to do your gearing to make sure that you're not going to be destroyed by the later game enemies that do a lot of damage. And also their racial power, it improves bartering prices by 25% for 300 seconds once per day, is in my opinion the worst of the racial powers available within all of the Requiem races, simply because later in the game money is not a concern to you at all. This might be moderately helpful for you early on when you're still tight on cash, but it becomes useless quite quickly. So overall, I think the Imperials make for an excellent combat class. They're very flexible. They have excellent stamina, which is very important for their sustainability in combat, but they are more difficult to gear because of their lack of resistances, and they don't have standout skills, especially because of their rather lackluster racial power, which I would personally rate a D. The Khajiit are, in my opinion, the strongest evasion-based combat class in the game. Their starting stats are weighted more towards stamina, but still a decent amount of health and magicka. And in previous versions of Requiem, the Khajiit actually had an active penalty to their spellcasting. That is no longer the case. However, their magicka regen is quite mediocre. This is offset by pretty good stamina regen, and they have the highest unarmed damage of any class in the game, getting a bonus 25 damage there for a total of 40. The biggest reason to play Khajiit, I would say, is their 15% faster movement speed. There are not many ways in Requiem to boost your character's movement speed. Even if you add a lot of stamina to your character, your movement speed still only goes up very slowly, and having that bonus gives the Khajiit an ability to get in and out of combat situations so that they can hit the enemy without getting hit back in return. The Khajiit also have a 65% reduced fall damage, which is pretty helpful in avoiding just random deaths from falling off of high buildings or so on, and also makes it possible to make some quick escapes that you would otherwise die from. And the Khajiit also have the strong stomach ability, which allows them to regenerate their stamina using bestial stew, which is incredibly strong. It makes it so that they can stay in combat much longer than they would be able to otherwise. Their skill rate bonuses are 10% for everything related to thievery, so lockpicking, pickpocket, stealth, and so on. And this tends to push them toward a more thievery and stealth-oriented playstyle. Although you're not required to go that way, you are incentivized to do that. They have a proficiency in pickpocket and sneak, as well as +10 lockpicking expertise at the start of the game. The Khajiit are actually the only class that can pickpocket without having any perks, and that's pretty handy because there are some quests that can be resolved non-violently just by pickpocketing a key or a note or so on. And so this has some utility and saves you some perk points, even if you decide not to go very heavily into the thievery style of path. The big downside of the Khajiit is they lack any starting resistance, so you have to think pretty hard about how you're going to gear them to make sure that you can resist the later game enemies' attacks. And their power of Night Eye, which allows you to see better in the dark, is, I would say, not very helpful unless you're using extremely dark settings or your mods have made it so that it's hard to see in the dark. This just doesn't do very much. You can also just turn up the brightness on your game if you're having trouble seeing. So I would call Night Eye a C- overall power, but the Khajiit, I would say, are still extremely strong just because of their faster movement speed. They make exceptionally good evasive warriors. They're really fun to play because you can run circles around your enemies, but you probably don't want to go too much into a spellcasting or heavy armored character with this race. The Nords are the original inhabitants of Skyrim and also make some pretty excellent warriors. They come with above average starting stats with 120 each of health and stamina and still 80 in magic, which is a little bit below average, but good enough where you could still cast a few spells. They have a bonus to their power attacks with 25% reduced stamina cost. That's really helpful if you're using a big two-handed weapon or a one-handed mace so that you're not running out of stamina as much in the middle of combat. They have skill rate bonuses of 10% for two-handed and smithing. Both of those are pretty helpful, especially two-handed can be quite slow to level up, so having a bonus there makes it so that you can get to your advanced perks more quickly. And they have a 5% bonus for light armor, heavy armor, block, and one-handed. So just a little bit of everything within the warrior category. A Nord can be a pretty much jack of all trades regardless of which type of armor or which type of weapon you decide that you want to use. One of the big bonuses of playing as a Nord is they come with starting resistance of 50% frost and 25% shock, which is the highest starting resistance of any class in the game. And it's especially helpful later in the game because a lot of the really deadly attacks that you're going to get hit with are either frost or shock based. So this makes your gearing a lot easier, especially if you're using a two-handed weapon and won't be able to equip a shield. You'll still be able to get pretty decent resistances going as a result. Their power allows them to do shouts with 0 cooldown for 5 seconds once per day. And so this lets you do some really powerful things like using slow time plus, say, elemental fury and then a fire breath to deal some damage and stagger your opponents. I would call this a B- power overall. The only reason I don't rate it higher is it's kind of finicky to change things around in your character screen to activate each of your different shouts, so it's a little bit clunky in order to actually use it, but it is powerful enough to definitely win you a fight when you really need it to happen. So while the Nords are definitely intended to be a barbarian type of character, using a big weapon and then just whatever armor of your choice, they can also be pretty good mages due to their high resistances, which makes it easier for them to win mage on mage battles, which are otherwise somewhat difficult. So if you're interested in just having a pretty flexible character with a focus on combat and you're not too worried about having evasive skills, the Nords can be an excellent choice for you. The Orcs are the strongest melee fighters within all of Skyrim. Their stats are weighted heavily toward health with 130 and then 110 stamina and just 60 magic, making them extremely poor casters unless you invest a lot of your level ups into there. They also have the highest carry weight at 125 and some of the best stamina regen at 1.7, making them very resilient for combat. They have a bonus for their power attacks with 35% lower stamina cost, as well as having the strong stomach ability so that they can eat the bestial stew, which makes it so that they can stay in combat a lot longer and are less likely to run out of stamina even if they're using a big two-handed weapon or a one-handed mace. Orcs get a 10% skill rate bonus for all of the warrior pattern except for archery, making it quite a bit faster to level up all of those skills, which can otherwise take a pretty long time. The big downside of playing as an orc is you don't come with any innate resistances, so you have to think pretty hard about how you're going to gear up your character, especially if you're not using a shield, to make sure that you're not overly vulnerable to mages, which are otherwise one of the big problems that a melee character can run into. Their racial power, Berserker Rage, is perhaps one of the best in the game. It gives double physical damage dealt, half physical damage taken. It restores a huge amount of stamina, all for 30 seconds, and it can be used once per day. This is like a get out of jail free card. It means that you're almost certain to win any conventional physical fight, and just being able to activate that at will and beat down whatever difficult enemy you're running into makes orcs really strong, really resilient, even against tougher opponents. So orcs, I think, are better suited to play as a two-handed and heavy armored character just because their racial abilities lend themselves well to that, and their stamina bonuses make it easy to keep up big swings with a two-handed weapon. And also because they have such little magic, it's hard to cast Alteration as a complement to use with light armor. It is nice, however, to be able to use something like Restoration if you're playing as an orc to take advantage of the Restoration ability to give you effective invincibility for a short time each day, which can make it a lot easier when you're fighting mages. One way to accomplish that is if you put a bunch of Restoration gear on Switch and then just switch over to your Restoration gear, cast your healing spell or whatever, and then go back to your heavy armor. It's a way you can get around the very low magic base that orcs start with. So if you're loving the idea of a melee-focused character, orcs are definitely the way to go, and with a little bit of creativity, you can get around their big downsides. The Redguards are another combat-focused race, which I would call somewhat of a cross between the Nords and the orcs. Their starting stats are weighted towards stamina with 120 and then 110 health, but only 70 magic, the second lowest only after the orcs. So if you want to use magic with them, you'll have to invest pretty heavily to get that stat up. They come with a bonus of 20% less stamina cost for their power attacks, which is really helpful. It means that they can stay in fights for longer and not have to worry as much about being accidentally disarmed or suddenly doing no damage due to low stamina. The Redguards get a skill rate bonus of 15% for one-handed, which is huge. One-handed is otherwise quite slow to level up, and this makes it much easier to do so. They also have a 5% bonus for block, archery, smithing, destruction, and alteration. So you can see the stats are kind of pushing you toward a battle mage style of play, where you're maybe using a sword in one hand and then a spell in the other. They come with innate resistance of 75% poison and 75% disease. Both of those are very helpful. A lot of the dangerous enemies that you fight in the mid-game, like the Altmer, will rely on poisons in order to damage you, and so this makes it quite a bit easier to gear. If you just cast the restoration spell of resist poison on yourself, then suddenly you're up to 100% poison resist, and then you don't have to worry about those anymore. And the Redguard power is very strong. It gives them 10 stamina restoration per second. It slows time by 50%, gives paralysis immunity, all for 30 seconds, and can be used once per day. I think of this as kind of Berserker Rage light. It's a little bit more defensive in nature, because you can use the slow time in order to dodge attacks, which is really helpful. And the stamina regeneration gives you an out if you've been fighting for a while and you don't have to go and chug potions in order to stay in it. I would call it an overall A. I'm only not rating it higher because against really tough enemies, even if you've got stamina, you may not be strong enough to kill them outright. But it's still extremely useful and really good for a melee-focused character, especially if you want to be dodging in and out to avoid enemy attacks. So I think Redguards, they're really pushed toward having one-handed attack skills and then using either heavy armor or light armor. I favor heavy armor slightly, both because the low magicka makes it a bit hard to cast alteration to augment light armor when you're playing as a Redguard, and also because having the 75% poison resist from the start, well, some of the best light armor is the Savior's Hide, and if you don't need to use that because you already have your poison and disease resist taken care of, you can focus your gear on other areas. So if you're looking for a pretty flexible one-handed melee character, Redguards can be a really excellent choice for that. Now that we've gone through the statistics on each of the different races, how does that actually help you as you go about playing the game of Requiem? You can tell the developers have put a lot of thought into balancing the races, and there's no obvious best, but there are some that are going to be easier for particular builds than others. Just looking at the starting statistics, the High Elves and the Imperials have an edge of 50 and 70 respectively additional total stats just at the start of the game. Because you only gain 5 stat points per level up, that's the equivalent of 10 or 14 respectively additional levels that you get just from the start in your statistics. But as the game goes on, this starts to be less impactful because you can pick up gear that adds 50, 100 or more stats to your character, and this starts to be less of a distinction between the Imperials and the High Elves and the other races. Something that might not be obvious from the starting stats, though, are the different stamina regeneration and magicka regeneration rates. If you're playing as a melee or an archery character, your stamina is your most important statistic because otherwise you just can't do any damage. And in that area, the Imperials and the Orcs have a nice edge with a higher stamina regeneration rate, followed closely by several of the other races, all of which make quite good warriors. Similarly, if you plan to play as a mage, your magicka regeneration will dictate how quickly you can refill and continue the fight. And in that area, the High Elves and the Bretons have an edge, followed closely by some of the other races. But if you chose a non-magic using race, well, you certainly could do it and could get through the game, but you might find yourself spending more time standing around waiting for your magicka to regenerate, which would cut into your ability to clear out the content. As you go further into Requiem, your resistances start to be extremely important. And in that area, the Nords, Dark Elves, and Bretons all get an edge with some starting resistance, which makes it easier for them to gear. The poison resistance you find on the Argonians and the Redguards is also helpful, although in my opinion, not quite as impactful as the elemental resistances, because you can use restoration to boost your poison resistance, but there's no corresponding effect for elemental other than an extremely high investment in alteration. Finally, the racial abilities can get some races out of difficult fights and make it a lot easier to take on bosses. And I've given my own subjective ratings of each of those as we went through the video. Some non-racial powers that are extremely useful are possessed by the Khajiit and by the Bosmer, which, although they have weaker racial powers, those different attributes also give them a significant edge. So that's all I had to say about the different Requiem races. I hope you found it helpful. If you want to be notified of future videos I do like this, then hit the subscribe button or leave me a comment with any suggestions or your own feedback on your experiences as you've played through Requiem using different races with your particular class.